From New York City, the National Broadcasting Company presents Tonight, starring Steve Allen. Just off the crossroads of the world, Times Square is NBC's Hudson Theater. That's where we're taking you now, tonight and every night. Now to meet the star of our show, Steve Allen.
Much of America first started staying up later on that night, 35 years ago tonight, September 27th, 1954. Gene Rayburn was the voiceover announcer telling you that Wally Cox and Willie Mays would be among the guests with the semi-regulars, Edie Gourmet, Steve Lawrence, Andy Williams. Did you think this was going to be the start of something big, to borrow a phrase?
In all honesty, Bob, I didn't. None of us connected with that show ever saw it as a capital B, capital D, big deal. We knew it was a good show and we were having a marvelous time doing it, but we didn't perceive it as among the great important things of television.
How much of the form did you invent?
About 97%. I had had a good break in being able to develop some of the separate building blocks on radio. I was working for CBS originally in Los Angeles for 3 years on a late night show. I would have been happy to do it on television, but they didn't have any television there. So it was 3 years and about an hour and a half a night of ad-lib comedy, audience interviews, jokes with the announcer, that sort of thing. And then CBS brought me to New York in the early 50s, and I did the same kind of thing for them at different times of day and night, starting at every night at 7 o'clock, and then went over to, spent the next 7 years with NBC, and pretty soon it became called The Tonight Show.
It was a local show for the better part of a year before it went national, right?
Right, yes.
And actually longer than even the Tonight Show of many years ago before it cut back to an hour. Johnny did an hour and a half. You did an hour and 45, right?
Yes, the reasons for that were odd. Nobody asked to do that. I would have been happy not to. But we were sponsored locally by Rupert Knickerbocker Beer, very big beer in those days. And they had a contractual understanding, so they still had me. And the network decided to lift me out of local and put me on the net. But because the beer people still had some rights, the compromise was to have them get their own 15 minutes locally before we hit the network. It was great. It was like an on-the-air warm-up.
You had the monologue, and you had the desk, but you didn't have a couch, right?
No, it was, as I've said before, Jack Parr who invented the couch. Some nights we would have 3 and 4 guests, but whenever another guest was about to come out, they'd rush in and put a chair over to the side of my desk in the same general relationship. But after my 4 years on the show, when Jack took over, he decided to not do about 412 things I had been doing. We did a lot of crazy camera stunts out in the street. We would go out there and play basketball with the Harlem Globetrotters or something of that sort. Or I'd dress up as a New York cop and go out and stop traffic and ad-lib funny lines. So as I say, Jack chose not to do most of that. He just chose to concentrate on the conversation part of it, and he did it for the next 5 years with the couch.
Now, I've seen clips of you being lowered into a vat of Jell-O. The human ice...
I lowered myself to do that.
The human iced tea bag. Giant pie fights. What are some of the others?
Oh, the writers figured out early that if I was in danger, literally sometimes in danger, I was funnier. I guess because of the emotional tension. One night they spread me out like a deer on the front of a car, and they gave me a helmet for protection. And the car drove straight ahead about 70 miles an hour into a fence that was on fire. That was a typical stunt, not an unusual one.
Letterman makes no bones about the fact that you're the guy who invented the stunts that are now called by a new generation Letterman-esque. Originally were Allen-esque. I mean, some of it to a T, like when David lowers himself into a vat of water as a human Alka-Seltzer tablet. Well, you had done that as a human iced tea bag.
Right.
Who's screaming one more time? Hey, it's iced tea. Now they put the ice cubes in. Here goes the sugar. Here goes the lemon. Just a little twist of lemon. Oh, a little twist of...
Tear it up a bit. We're really making tea. Tear it up, Steve.
gentlemen, tea is served.
Well, it's to David's great credit. He gives great credit. He always is kind enough to bring up my name when he gets interviewed on any full-length basis. He used to watch the show that I did in the early 60s, a similar but somewhat even wilder show. And he was going to college in Indiana at the time, Ball State University, and that was his favorite show. So he has reported having said then, gee, I'd like to grow up and get into television, and if I ever do, I'd like to do that kind of a show. So he got into television, and that's the kind of show he's doing.
How difficult was it to stage that giant pie fight? Now, I know you're a guy who's interesting in that you're a literate man, and you might put, I say a literate man, not an illiterate man. You know, you might very well have sat for an hour and a half with Carl Sandburg, but the next night you and Soupy Sales were throwing pies at one another, and you never had any trouble changing gears that way. But you outdid yourself one night when everybody in the whole audience was on with a pie.
Yes, those were sometimes plots almost on my life by the gang that put the show together. In many cases, I was in on what was going to be planned, but often they would not let me know. I think when they had the mass pie fight, somebody had put a pie under every seat in the theater, and we were originally really going to surprise the audience, but the lawyers heard about it and could see all the lawsuits from ruined furs and, you know, stolen earrings or whatever. So they forced us to pass out invisible, transparent raincoats to everybody, which took a little of the laughs off it. But it sure looks funny on camera.
And now, after 365 days of absolute torture, as Art Baker used to say, you asked for it. Johnny Wilson, you're going to get it tonight.
Did you ever get punched in the nose? A man on the street interview kind of situation? You and Tom Poston out there?
Well, the men on the street things properly were all written and rehearsed, but if you're talking about taking a camera on the street and literally ad-libbing, certain odd things happened. One night I came out of a theater when we were down at Columbus Circle, and we passed a wino bum. It wasn't a homeless guy, he was just a wino bum. And I was surprised to see him, and he was surprised to see me. And for one thing, his zipper was undone. And for another thing, I said something like, "How are you?" And he gave me an indecent gesture. And those things were live. But we never got a postcard because they knew we didn't plan it, you know.
What did the cabbie say? When you hailed a cab and you had like a Hebrew national salami, and you thrust it kind of through the window?
I stopped about 5 cars that night. This was on 44th Street behind the Hudson Theater, just off Times Square. I was dressed as a New York cop, not a Keystone cop, but they bought me as a cop. They thought I was legit. Because there were bright lights in their eyes, they couldn't get too sharp a look at me. So when you see a cop go like that, you stop for him, you know, so every car stopped for me, except one that sped around me and almost knocked me down. That was even funnier somehow. I guess he was on the lam. But in this case, the driver said, "Where to, Chief?" So I opened the back door, threw in a big 4-foot salami, and I said, "Take this to Grand Central and fast." And he sped right off.
Sped off?
I often wondered what he did when he got to Grand Central. Hey, who wants the salami?
Or if the salami had the decency to tip him.
Yeah. A little salami tip. But
now, as a sportscaster, I have a special interest in Big Bill Allen.
Yeah, good old Big Bill. He was a kind of a takeoff on the earlier generation of guys like Ted Using and Bill Stern.
Yeah.
They all wore those Karl Malden fedoras. And I used to do another character that people get mixed up. It was the guy that did the angry letters to the editor, and I had that silly little card that said "Press" in the front brim of the hat. It was the same hat, but as Big Bill, I didn't have the press card. Yeah, one night, if that's what you have in the clip box over there, I got laughing, and then it was the old laughing in church syndrome. I could not stop laughing. I knew I should, but the more I knew I should, the less I could.
Well, what's new in sports? I'll tell you what's new. The 1958 ouch baseball season is getting underway with the annual...
Later continues in a moment.
Back with the original host of The Tonight Show, Steve Allen, on this, the exact 35th anniversary of the first national broadcast of The Tonight Show. Now, during the first segment, you mentioned a staple of Steve Allen shows, not just The Tonight Show, but all the subsequent Steve Allen shows, the angry letters to the editor.
Yes.
Totally unrehearsed. These are actual letters from last week's, Tuesday of last week, in the New York Daily News.
Yes, this gives me, Bob, the chance to say that over the years, 40 years, we never used a phony letter. They were always actually from either this paper or some paper around the country. And the point of it is that these letters are written in white-hot fury, but often when we read them at home, we don't get angry. That's wrong. I think we should. Therefore, I read them in an angry tone. Okay, let's see what this is. Brooklyn. A lot of anger there already, right? Okay. What right? I love letters that start with, yeah. What right do movie stars, TV personalities, or sports figures have to endorse a New York City candidate for mayor when some of them are not even eligible to vote in the election?
That's right.
Do they think they know what is best for us when they... No, sir. When they live in a different state? Yeah. Signed, William F. Buckley. I changed the name of the senators to prevent a punch in the mouth. One more. Poughkeepsie. For God's sake. Okay, Poughkeepsie. At some point, the TV networks must come to understand the other... What do you mean, absolutely? I haven't even made my point. You see, I'll start again. At some point, the TV networks must come to understand the utter stupidity, yes, of presenting an opposing view when the president is attempting to mobilize support to deal with a national problem. Signed, General Noriega. Anyway, I rest my case. And I have a very tight
There you
case.
have it, ladies and gentlemen.
Letters to the damned editor.
Here's one just to tell you. This is a really furious letter from Staten Island. It says, I wonder how the women of New York feel now about their hero, Nelson Rockefeller. Yeah, they elected him because they liked his smile and his way of speaking and dressing. Well, how do they like his way of raising taxes? Signed, Averill Harriman.
You know what I didn't realize was that after you left The Tonight Show, the average person would say, all right, Jack Parr succeeded Steve Allen, but not directly.
No, if you can believe it, the network to whose behavior I sometimes refer in my lectures on reason, literally, and semantics and all that, they acted on a conditioned response. Ordinarily, if there's a Joe Krellman show and Joe says, I think I'll die or I'll go away, there's no more Joe Krellman show. They throw it away and they get a new show to replace it. So that's what they did. Just because I was quitting, because I was doing, as I say, something more important, I thought, well, that's the end of the Tonight Show. And they happened to, there would never have been a Tonight Show to this day again had it not been for the fortuitous circumstance that the show they replaced it with was beyond lousy, into the twilight zone of terribleness. It was called America After Dark. And on paper, it must have sounded like a good idea. It probably stacked up as a very strong, persuasive memo, because it said, hey, we'll have cameras all over America. We'll have live cameras from Chicago and New York and Denver and San Francisco, and we'll have a famous journalist in each town interviewing somebody exciting. Not a bad idea, but the show was dreadful because most journalists don't speak too well. They write great, but they don't speak too well.
They had big-name guys like Irv Kupcinet from Chicago and Earl Wilson, who was, mega famous at the time.
Well, look, Ed Sullivan was a journalist. Did he speak well? If he did, where would Jackie Mason be today? Anyway, for that reason, primarily, it was a dumb show. So it was only because it was so terrible that they had to get it off, and they didn't have enough time to dream up a third alternative, that in their panic, they said, what'll we... Oh, I know, we'll get the Tonight Show back, and we'll ad-lib with that till we find something better. And, of course, they never found anything better.
So when you went on to do the Sunday Night Show, you're head-to-head with Ed Sullivan, and again, something that people might not remember, Ed Sullivan, Steve Allen, and Maverick are the three competing network shows.
Yeah, that came
tough
along.
Choice.
That came along in our third year. Opposite Ed, everything was just great. I mean, most of the time he had the higher rating, and we had the higher rating often enough to keep NBC happy, because before that, they couldn't beat him at all. We did it our second week, for example, by nothing more clever than booking Elvis, and we would get, let's say, a 23 on our own. Elvis gave us about 7 more points, so we beat Ed that night. That was no great trick. But What's the question?
I forget. Maverick was on,
Oh, yeah,
which
Maverick
was a
came
darn
along.
good show, and Ed Sullivan and
Yeah,
you.
and our third year, Maverick loused everything up because there was not enough of an audience to make 3 networks happy, all in the same, competitive situation. So NBC lifted me out and dropped me into, I think, Wednesday nights or Monday nights, I forget which.
Didn't a feud break out between you and Ed Sullivan over the booking of Elvis Presley?
The feud, as such, was really a product of media inflation. There was a difference of opinion, just as there are, differences of opinion between 2 guys that change tires at a gas station on the corner. Nobody ever rushes in with cameras and said, "Oh, Ed and Gus, can we make a feud out of this? You want the tires put on the front wheel?" It was no more important than that, really. The New York Journal-American had a headline. This is not a lie. It said, "Allen Sullivan feud," as if it were saying World War III. I remember thinking, something's very wrong about this. I know old Ed and I know old me, and we ain't that important. But I failed to realize that television was that important. So any little thing...
Well, regardless of who had first dibs on Elvis, you both profited from it, because everybody remembers Elvis's appearance on Sullivan and only shooting from the waist up, and you had a great idea where you didn't have to worry, really, about Elvis's appearance.
Well, we didn't worry because we were doing a comedy show. Ed did a variety show, and a fine one, but that's not what we were doing. Ours was comedy, as I say. So we made laughs with Elvis. We had him sing Hound Dog, but to a real hound dog, and we had him dressed like Fred Astaire in evening clothes, white tie. And then he and Andy Griffith and Imogene Coca and I worked in a Western satire that I'd written called something, I don't know, Cowboy Steve and the Gang or some dumb title. And we had great laughs with Elvis, and he had a good time, too. But we were offered 5 more appearances with him, but we said no thanks, that it would have been too much trouble to try to make him funny every week. I would rather show how funny Louie and I was, and Tom Poston and Don Knotts and Pat Harrington and that great gang.
Well, anyway, in case you're just joining us, this is Tonight. And I can't think of too much to tell you about it, except I want to give you the bad news first. This program is going to go on forever. Boy, you think you're tired now. Wait till you see 1 o'clock roll around. It's a long show. Goes on from 11:30 here in the East, that is, from 11:30 to 1 in the morning. And we especially selected this particular theater. This is a New York theater called the Hudson, and we especially selected this for this very late show because this theater's, I think it sleeps about 800 people.
Continuing with Steve Allen, let's get some quick thoughts on your successors. Jack Paar.
Jack, as I said earlier, did a marvelous job for 5 years. One of the reasons that Jack was so interesting is that he's never been able to control his emotions. Now, if he were in the insurance business, that would have been a great handicap. But because of what he did for a living, hosting a talk show, it was marvelous for him. He was never dull. He was always interesting, to say the same thing inside out. And it's remarkable, the contrast with Johnny Carson. Johnny keeps all of his emotional cards very close to his vest. He reveals nothing about himself on his talk show.
Carson.
Johnny, what more can you say? What is it, 27 years he's been there now? Somebody, when Johnny first began to talk about quitting about 8 or 10 years ago, which might have been a ploy for salary negotiations, all the media always calls me up. I'm supposed to be the great expert on talk shows. What would you advise Johnny to do? The question itself never seemed too hip to me. I said, well, if we play this little game that I'm supposed to take this question seriously, because Johnny has not put an ad in the paper asking me to call, I said, but if we play the game that way, I would advise him not to quit. What else is he going to do? He's not going to go to Broadway. There's nothing else he has in mind. He's a great talk show host. So he should stay right there on the job until he drops dead on camera some night at the age of 86. And it looks like he's going to do that.
Did it trouble you, does it trouble you, that subsequent generations don't realize that Karnak is really the question man, and
No.
you went out in the audience and did stuff?
Yeah. There are certain moments, like once I did the question man, which I had done for years before Johnny, as you say, did Karnak, and I got a letter from a young person saying, hey, that's Johnny Carson's routine. Getting that letter was annoying, but that's the only time, because all the people that one would want to impress know who did the routine first. I didn't come here to talk against Johnny.
Sure.
You raised the question.
And I don't think anybody in your position feels as if just because you did it first, it can't be done in some different form. If that were the case, show business, by and large, would have ended long ago. Everything, somebody has to be there first, somebody has to invent it, and there's nothing wrong with modifying it, changing it, or even copying it.
Well, it depends on what the specific is. The fact that there are now 47 talk shows, I don't mind that at all, even though I did the first one. That's okay, because it's like having invented the paperclip anyway. It's not a thing like, you know, the cure for cancer. But on the other hand, I would have preferred that some of the actual comedy routines were still recognized as my property. Since you raised that question, I think it's important to make that distinction.
There used to be an old Friars Club kind of joke that said, hey, nice outfit, airlines lose your luggage. But in this case...
It did happen, yes. I would not appear on such an important program so attired, but TWA lost my bags, folks. And I may dress like this for about a week.
So go figure, ladies and gentlemen. Commemorating the 35th anniversary of the first Tonight Show broadcast, it was a pleasure to have Steve Allen with us tonight, and we'll see you later.
Join us tomorrow night for actor Donald Sutherland.